So, hello everybody. Thanks to everyone for their interest in this meeting, webinar organized jointly by Table.Briefings and by the Wuppertal Institute on the outcomes and potential ways forward from the recent climate conference in Belém in Brazil. My name is Wolfgang Obergassel. I'm co-head of the research unit on global climate governance at the Wuppertal Institute. And I'm very pleased to be able to moderate this very expert panel. With me are my Wuppertal Institute colleague, Max Schulze-Steinen. Then we have Avantika Goswami from the Center for Science and the Environment in India. We have Ana Perez-Catala from IDRI, the French Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations in France. And we have Bernhard Pötter from Table.Briefings, leading the Climate.Table in particular. Thanks to all of you for being here. And we will kick off with a very brief overview by my colleague Max Schulze-Stein. Overview on what was at stake in Belém and some of the main outcomes. And then we will go into our expert discussion on how to assess what happened and what came out of the conference and potential ways forward. So with that, over to you, Max. Take it away.
All right. Thank you, Wolfgang. I hope you can all hear me well. Yeah, looks like it. As Wolfgang said, with this presentation, this presentation is meant to be a little thematic warm-up, so that we're all on somewhat of the same page. So if that is your fifth post-COP recap, then some of that will probably be familiar with you, so you can stand up and get your lunch out of the microwave or whatever. For all others, I try to briefly summarize the COP, and I do that on the basis of our COP30 analysis, which the Wuppertal Institute published just end of last week, with the title, The Bitter Cup of Truth, Belém 2025 Climate Conference Not Up to the Challenge. And we chose that title because Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil, he declared that this climate conference will be the COP of truth, a narrative which was often picked up by different delegates and negotiators, reference into, oh, we are here at the COP of truth, and also flanked by initiatives against disinformation and on information integrity. And these initiatives were broadly considered or perceived positive, while part of this truth also is that the COP30 outcomes fall far back behind of what is needed. And what is needed is very nicely illustrated here in this graph by the Climate Action Tracker. Many of you probably know that. So we are at 1.3 degrees warming in 2023, and we have the 1.5 goal, or rather a limit than a goal. And right now, with all the current policies and actions in place right now, we end up to be like on plus 2.6, or in a range between 3.3 and 2 plus 1. And you can kind of go down that if you consider all the pledges and targets, then we are on 2.2. And if we have the most optimistic scenarios, drawing on best case scenario, assuming full implementation of all announced targets, net zero targets, long-term strategies, and so on, we might eventually come to 1.5, but even in that most optimistic target, the average is 1.9. So that underlines, and I think this is always important to state that, and even, as I said again, it's no big news for all of us probably, but it's also for me too important to underline that again and again and again, that the 1.6 warming already implies immense harm to ecosystems and human livelihoods. So with that, if you followed COP, then you probably often heard something like this COP will or was extra tricky, or given the geopolitical situation, it's already a win when the world can come together and discuss multilaterally. And kind of to broaden the picture of the current COP, we thought it's interesting to see in what time of polycrisis the COP took place. So if you go back to COP26, 2021, supposed to be 2020 in Glasgow, which was then postponed due to the COVID pandemic. And then COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, we had the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine. And the following year in Dubai, COVID was still a thing, especially because with the associated socioeconomic hardships and kind of slowly fading out. This is why I put it in brackets here, but we had still the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. And then in Baku, Ukraine, Gaza, Trump too. And now in Belém, you had all that and confrontational trade policies. So you had crises adding up on each other. And then in parallel to that, you have the accelerating climate crisis, making, again, like year after year after year, you have floods and heat waves and fires and all that. So this kind of is in parallel to all this geopolitical crisis listed here. If we then look at COP expectations and realities, I really don't want to go too deep into that because it's all in the past, but I think it's good to kind of understand the outcome and to, as I said, have an understanding of the things we will be discussing in a bit. We had like a pre-COP roller coaster. So we had a big hooray, yay, it's hosted in democratic Brazil with an ambitious government and an ambitious presidency after we've been in autocratic fossil regimes the last 3 years. This was a bit of a relief. You see here in the picture on the top left, the Correa do Lago, the COP president, very experienced climate diplomat, I think 25 years. Also the first, when I remember correctly, the first COP president, which was also a negotiator before, with the Brazilian president, Lula da Silva. So perceived in a positive way, but then shortly before COP, kind of it went down. So the same government, which we perceived as ambitious, faces the challenge of balancing out short-term economic opportunities and long-term low or net zero emissions goals. And the short-term economic opportunities are fossil fuels on their territory. So they gave permission to drill for oil near the mouth of the Amazon River, which is of course in contrast to the climate goals that we have. A good thing was space for civil society and indigenous people. It was the Saturday in between the two COP weeks. We had a big march with over 70,000 people attending in Hot Belém with the funeral of fossil fuels, which you see in the picture here with these big coffins carrying around in the streets. So that was big, but then in the same time, logistical challenges. Could that actually be the most exclusive COP? Because hotel prices were super expensive. To actually get to Belém was tricky. I think in the end, over 50,000 people accredited. So of course, it's a question who that was. But of course, there was the risk that this COP will be actually the most exclusive. 10 years of the Paris Agreement. Last COPs were more focusing on political bargaining. That one should be about implementation. Also, next to this will be a COP of truth. It was also said this will be an implementation COP, and how far that happened, we probably will discuss in a bit. And then during COP, a lot of things happened. I often heard the reference of that this COP was a biblical conference because you had heavy rainfalls, you had mosquitoes, you had heat. you had a mob raiding the COP venue, and then if you thought it can't get any wilder, a fire actually broke out on the Friday, I think, so shortly before closing. After, 24 hours delay, as always, COP closes with a big delay because there were arguments about key issues. But the beginning actually started quite smooth, so there was no agenda fight, despite the demand of adding new items to the agenda. And that is already one interesting point to look at, because the way the presidency kind of avoided the agenda fight was to put contested issues into so-called presidency consultations, which then shall be picked up in the final text. And they focused on four main things, which were, to summarize, weak NDCs, transparency reports, provision of finance, and unilateral trade measures. And these four things, they were not included in the official COP agenda, even though parties wanted it to be there, but then kind of carried towards the end of the conference, where we then saw the Mutirão decision. So here the key issues, so I'm jumping now to the end of the COP. The key issues were addressed in this Global Mutirão decision, which was, next to the Cup of Truth, another big narrative the presidency developed. So Mutirão is a term from indigenous languages describing community-based, based with multiple actors, an action towards a common aim, right? So the presidency says, join us in our no global Mutirão towards our common aim. So this final text, which you see here on the bottom, a global Mutirão uniting humanity in a global mobilization against climate change. However, the final text falls far short on what is needed to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So one reason why the COP was delayed by 27-ish hours, you saw, or we don't see any language on tough on transitioning away from fossil fuels, despite an alliance with over 80 countries asked for it. So no language on fossil fuels, no picking up on the GST decision, and heavy block by fossil states. And you also saw no provision to halt or reverse deforestation. So from that view, a very weak outcome on what is needed to keep 1.5 within reach. And the only thing which we see towards that was only voluntary and rather vague, unspecified initiatives like the Global Implementation Accelerator or the belay mission to 1.5, which are in the text. One other thing I want to briefly mention here, an analysis by Carbon Brief, they looked at the verbs which described the paragraphs in the text, and they show how the Global Mutirão decision mainly uses inactive words like recognize and recall. So words which are not as strong as the active verbs, where they say we request or resolve. And so that kind of, I think, also gives an interesting view of how strong this text actually is. And the few active words which are in the text often describes actions from the COP itself. So we decide to implement the Global Implementation Accelerator, which is voluntary. So yeah, not that strong. Last slide. Just some further observations from our analysis report. So again, COP30 fails to further build on the outcomes of the first GST, especially on mitigation. That is a big loss. One of the few wins, there's a decision to develop as a just transition mechanism. This mechanism aims to promote international cooperation, technical assistance, capacity building, also technology transfer to ensure a just transition, especially in global south countries. different from stated intention. COP30 was not a forest COP, not really though. I mean, you might hear Lula saying, oh, we bring the COP to the Amazon because it's going to be a forest COP, which from our point of view, it wasn't really a forest COP. However, there were two main events or main items outside the formal negotiations. One was the famous TFFF, the Tropical Rainforest Forever Facility, a fund to protect tropical forests worldwide, and the renewing of the Forest and Climate Leaders Pledge. But here, I mean, it has to say it's a missed opportunity to advance the integration between climate and biodiversity within the UNFCCC framework. There was a conclusion of the Baku adaptation roadmap. So we have now 59 indicators to measure progress under the global goal of adaptation. Then it was observed in how far the three advisory options from international courts are reflected in the decisions or also in the negotiations. I heard them being referenced in many side events. So these advisory options that underline the clarity that states have a moral duty or a moral obligation to mitigate climate change, and that this is actually deeply rooted in international and in international treaties, but that we don't really see reflected in the texts. We have a setup of a two-year work program to develop the solutions to fulfill the NCQG, so the new collective quantified goal. So finance and climate finance. Of course, the challenge how to pay the 300 billion from global north countries with the tight fiscal budget, which are happening right now, and also the backlash regards climate action. So big question mark towards finance, and then lastly also for finance, but it's a little positive sparkle that there was an appeal for the efforts towards tripling adaptation finance by 2035. That was all a lot and a little sprint. If you want to read that more in a slower space and more in depth, here's a QR code to the report that we just published, also online on the wuppertal.org, wupperins.org webpage. With that, many thanks for your attention. Looking forward to the discussion and giving back to Wolfgang now.
Thank you very much indeed, Max, for this very concise overview on what was at stake and some of the main outcomes. Yeah, different from previous COPs, there wasn't one big topic. There were a lot of big topics, or smaller, not so big topics, but important. And yeah, this is our take on what were some of the most important ones. Yeah, so with that, we'll move to the discussion. So since a bit of time has already passed and a lot of texts have already been written and a lot of discussions have already been held, we've decided that for this discussion here, we'll rather focus not so much on drilling down on details, but more on the big picture and potential ways forward. And for that purpose, yeah, I envisage to have several rounds of interventions here on the panel on a number of questions. And just to keep matters simple, I'll, for the first round, go by the alphabetical order of first names and then mix it up later for the subsequent rounds. So the first question on which I would be interested in your views is, well, as always, there's a discussion, is it actually worth the bother having these conferences each year with tens of thousands of participants, lots of carbon dioxide being emitted and so on? Then you have the others who say, yes, it is worth the effort for this and that reason. So I'd like to hear your views in general. well, the COP is no world government, and it is operating to the consensus principle. And there's the poly crisis now in the background, which Max referred to at the beginning of his presentation. So giving all these framework conditions and limitations, what do you think, what can the COP actually realistically contribute to addressing climate change? And to what extent did COP30 in Belém deliver on this potential? So realistically speaking, did we get as much out of this conference as we could have, or did it underdeliver, even measured against a realistic benchmark? Yeah, and as I said, I'll go by alphabetical order. So first up, Anna, and then Avantika, and then Bernhard. So Anna, the floor is yours. Go ahead, please.
Thanks so much, Wolfgang. And thanks so much, first of all, for inviting us at EDRI to contribute to this great webinar. I'm looking forward to the discussion. And you pose a very difficult question, but I'm sure between all of us, we will provide some ideas of where the answer is. I mean, I believe, and I think we will broadly agree that still COPs are a pivotal forum for mobilizing a wide constellation of actors. Like Max was explaining how 50,000 plus participants were there, despite the high cost, the logistical hurdles. So that's clear. They still mobilize a lot of people and create like a great momentum. Of course, these still means we need other forms of international cooperation, one that really looks better into what are the implementation challenges, what are the leverage points, and combined with what Max was also explaining, like the evolving geopolitical reality is very, very clear how it affected this COP, and something we can discuss further if we want. To me, what really to assess if this COP delivered to its potential, or what can actually COPs do going forward, it goes very much with this narrative of, are we really in the post-negotiation era? Is there any way we are actually focusing on more implementation to transform these pledges into action? And of course, we cannot say the COP was entirely successful on this, but it did deliver some things that we can highlight and that help understand a bit what happened at this COP and what can happen going forward. Four broad areas of progress to us stand out. And the first of them is really, to me and for EDRI, this COP is really a realization of the status of the discussion globally, entering through the door of the COP and being like, hey, we are here, in the sense of like, there's a really growing interest from parties to talk about what is the distribution of the economic opportunities that are generated by the ecological transition. So how trade, industrial policy, investment, cooperation have to align with the climate goals. And we have seen this with the new trade dialogue being established at COP30. And to us, it's a recognition that climate policy now is more like development and economic policy, that not only climate. And this is something you could have been arguing for years, but now is like really real, also because of the geopolitical conditions we live in. Second point, the COP had to answer to the latest NDC submissions and see if we are actually on target to what Max was showing in the presentation at the beginning. We are seeing how, the COP responded to them. You cannot say with like full ambition, more could have been done. But when it responded to the NDC submission, it did link it to adaptation, to implementation. So for example, the Mutirão decision talks about what is the existing role of the Paris Agreement provisions, such as the NDCs, the national adaptation plans, the BTRs and transparency, the LTLEDs, and how they can be tools for later implementation. What is missing here, and we have also said that to really move like let's say the more like hardcore Paris architecture and mechanisms to implementation is also the finance outcomes. We had a very basic outcome on adaptation finance. And if we look at the Baku to Belém roadmap and how it was taken up, it's very light. And this needs to be taken up somewhere else. We need other fora to take up the conclusions of this roadmap to advance on the options that it gave. Third, and I'll go very fast, we know that UNFCCC cannot deliver all the objectives alone. We need international cooperation, and there's challenges that the UNFCCC cannot handle. So the UNFCCC tried to put some initiatives, to send some things that bridge the efforts inside and outside. So there's the implementation accelerator. Of course, no one really knows still what it is, but it's supposed to help on the implementation of NDCs and NAPs. And there's the Belém mission to 1.5, which is supposed to focus on enabling conditions such as international cooperation. So trying to build that bridge between the inside and the outside world. That is the only way we really get to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. And because we're seeing that all the goals of the global stocktake are advancing slowly, these may become like de facto spaces for advancing the implementation of these goals. And finally, not very famous inside the negotiation space, but the reform of the action agenda is like a good thing that this presidency did and that the presidencies will keep doing forward, and that, going back to the question, that is something that COPs can still do, and that's actually useful for. There was a full reform of the Global Climate Action Agenda that looks also at what happens beyond the UNFCCC system with businesses and cities and things like this. And the way it was reorganized is around 6 thematic axes that reflects the outcomes of the first global stocktake, and that is key for having a more structured approach to implementation, or that at least in our view. So I'll stop here. I'm sure there are many comments and things to come forward.
Thank you very much, Anna, for this first set of insights. Then Avantika, you're up next. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much for having me on here once again. Really enjoyed last year's discussion, and thanks for the opening comments from the other panelists. So I find a lot of alignment with what has already been said. I think the landscape and summary by the Geopolitical Institute was very comprehensive, and IDRI, of course, we have a lot of alignment always. So I think the way I'm organizing my thoughts in response to this question is thinking about 3 things. What was the global environment going into COP30? What were the actual dynamics that played out at the conference? And what was actually needed, or what is needed going forward? So I'll try to keep it very brief. So in terms of the global environment, this was a very tough year, no doubt. I think the whole description of COP being biblical should apply not just to the fire and what happened at the COP, but even the world events going into the climate summit. Climate was not an issue this entire year. It should have been. It should always be intersecting with other issues, but it really wasn't. We had trade wars, we had military conflicts, we had many pressing items which are on the agenda for multiple countries. So I think there was this sense of, is this climate summit really going to be relevant? Is anyone even going to care about, what's being discussed? So I think in that environment, what ended up being put on the table, where we expected a COP with not a clear headline item, we ended up having many big ticket items on the agenda eventually, formal and informal agenda. So I think that was interesting. It was a contrast from what we expected going into the conference. Now, in terms of the actual dynamics that played out and the actual core political process, I think we knew in advance, and I'll speak a little bit more about the G77 in China and the developing countries essentially. They had clear agenda items that they had put forth. So we knew there would be discussions on the Just Transition Work Program. We knew there would be discussions under the Global Goal on Adaptation. So these were formal agenda items that have been under preparation, under discussion since Bonn in June, in the intersessional period. There was also proposals to put formal agenda items for Article 9.1 and unilateral trade measures. So I think most countries were working with a very formal kind of process-based method, following the protocols of the UNFCCC. And also we had out-of-process discussions like the Baku to Belém roadmap, which I think sort of died somewhere as soon as the conference opened. But I think once we actually got to the conference, the first week was quite constructive. Many are disagreeing with the method of the presidency consultations, but we did hear a lot of feedback from many negotiators, particularly developing country negotiators, that the presidency consultations were actually being conducted in very good faith in the first week. And they had really commended the Brazilian presidency for facilitating that process to really tackle some of the very sticky and contentious issues. So everything so far was kind of by the book and put into a formal process. But come the second week, we had the insertion of this transition away from fossil fuels roadmap. And it's a very, very critical process. And we have all been raising questions since Dubai about what happens to the Dubai decision to transition away from fossil fuels. However, in an environment where something like this has not been tabled in the months leading up to COP and has not really been multilaterally discussed by all parties and agreed upon, and consensus hasn't been achieved, the insertion of this roadmap created quite a lot of disruption to what was the formal negotiating mandate of the conference. And this is where I think a lot of the trust started breaking down. I think the narratives that developing countries were blocking the transition away from fossil fuel or the TAF roadmap, I hope that has been dispelled by now, because I think analysis has shown that even the G77 was sitting at various points of the spectrum on their positions on the TAF roadmap. But the really key point of contention was that this was not negotiated, this was not on the agenda, but somehow in the second week, this is what captured all of the headlines, and this is what became the defining outcome and the litmus test of COP30 for many countries and many entities, stakeholders, groups. So this is the part that we are a bit disconnected with, that there is intent. All of the G77 and China agreed to the global stocktake outcome to transition away from fossil fuels. Multiple developing countries have submitted new NDCs with ambition to the best of their capabilities. So I think this narrative that emerged in the second week of developing countries not wanting the transition away from fossil fuels, and we know there are particular countries who are much more vocal than others. I think that really created a lot of unnecessary mistrust and kind of tension in the process. And honestly, in our view, this should not be the main litmus test of COP. This was a COP where developing countries had the agenda to triple adaptation finance, to win a just transition mechanism. They had put forth requests to discuss trade measures, Article 9.1. Somehow the news cycle is focusing solely on how fossil fuels isn't mentioned in the outcome. I think there is a bit of a disconnect there. Are we voicing the interests of the global majority in our post-COP news headlines and analyses, or just the views and kind of new passions of just a few set of countries? And I say new passions because the TAF roadmap is not something the European Union had vociferously supported before COP, going into the COP. It's something that came up only in the second week and was then supported by a handful of countries. So I think that's what caused a bit of the kind of disconnect for many of us. On my last point, and I'll wrap up quickly now, what we actually need going forward, I think I have full alignment with Anna that, we need to talk about implementation now. And also what she mentioned about climate policy intersecting with development policy. This is something CSE has spoken about since 1992 and many other organizations as well. This kind of reckoning that we can no longer talk about decarbonization or climate action in isolation, but it has to be talked in tandem with trade policy, with global financial system reform, with actual development aspirations of countries. I think this is becoming more and more apparent. It's always been something that we have advocated for from the Global South. But the question is, how do we actually do this? Do we continue to kind of wrap ourselves in the political theater of the COP process, about who are the blockers, who are the ambition havers, when a lot of that is actually quite disconnected from what is happening out in countries and in the real world. Countries are moving on the transition. Today, 51% of solar power globally is produced by BRICS countries. You have massive ambition being shown by countries like China. Countries like India are in a tough position because our power demand is growing at something like 9% per year. So it's kind of a fossil as well as renewables strategy. But India today is like third or fourth highest in renewable energy capacity in the world. So how are we actually reckoning with what is happening on the ground in the borders of countries, how they are taking on differentiated pathways towards the transition, and how are we actually putting real finance as well as enabling trade rules on the table to make this process faster? Um, these are the conversations we need to now be having at the COP, as opposed to this kind of political, blaming and shaming. But I think, yeah, this is really the challenge going forward, and happy to discuss this further in the conversation today. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Amantika, for these very insightful views. Just to add on what's really happening in the real economy or in real countries out there, just this morning I saw a new study discussing how a number of East African countries are becoming pioneers on electric mobility, based on very ambitious domestic policies. So Kenya, Ethiopia, and a number of countries are really moving forward on that one. Yeah, and on that basis, it's really, yeah, I fully agree that somehow the COP is really disconnected to a large extent from what's happening in the real world. And I guess one of the questions going forward is how can we overcome this disconnect and use the COP to actually accelerate these processes? Yeah, and with that, I turn it over to Bernhard. Go ahead. What's your views on what can the COP actually do, and to what extent did COP30 deliver on what it can do or could have done?
Yeah, thank you, Wolfgang. Always these questions after we get home after a COP. Yeah, and again, thanks for organizing this. It's always good to, with 1 or 2 weeks afterwards, to look back and think what happened to me and to the rest of the world in these 2 weeks. Just, I mean, a lot has been said from Anna and from Avantika, and most of that I can just underwrite without any problems. Just some thoughts from my side on this. Wolfgang, you asked in the beginning the old question: is it worth it? 50,000 people traveling across the world, and I get all these questions all the time when I do my work as a journalist here. And I always say, well, I don't think that's a question. I mean, for every football game in the Champions League, you have 50,000 people getting on a plane, flying somewhere. So if once a year, 50,000 people go and get together to talk about these real important issues, that's a drop in the ocean, so to say. So that's the thing. The second thing that comes to my mind is, and I'm not going to wrap up everything here, but just some splinters of my thoughts here. I think the idea of an implementation COP, as this was supposed to be, is a contradiction in itself, because the COP does not implement anything, and that is something I think we've seen here very drastically. And also, to me, as someone who has been at a lot of these COPs, this is becoming more clearer and clearer that implementation is happening if it's happening somewhere else. And the COP can, if at its best, the COP can lay some ground rules, can get the so to say the frame for implementation happening. And but we have come, and that I think that's something that people are. It's hard to realize that after a decade, or actually a decade before Paris and a decade after Paris, leading up to Paris and after Paris, now having the structure, having the framework for most of that, and having also filled out more of that structure, we are now at a position when COPs actually, and that's hard to say for someone who's going there, but COPs actually don't matter so much anymore. And one of the things is that I was flabbergasted at the end of the COP when Simon Steele came and said at the closing press conference and said, well, the next big thing the COPs are going to decide will be at COP33, the next GST. So I asked myself, so why should I go to COP31 and 32 if in 33 we'll have the next big thing to decide? And so if the COPs stay the way they are, or they see themselves as something or as a place where things are being decided, important things, I think we are going to run into problems because people have to realize that things are going and things are already being decided outside the COP, and we might come to that later. Wolfgang, you also asked the questions: where do we take it from now? Which fora would we see? And I think there are some. There are quite interesting some. But I think that is something to keep in mind if we talk about the COPs. Having said that, I think one of the most important things that this COP had to deliver was to keep the whole thing together. After the US leaving, there was let's walk back a month or two. There was a lot of fear that the whole thing would explode with the US getting out and maybe not knowing how the Trump administration would react and would act on we all had the IMO scheme in front of us that maybe the US would destroy the whole thing from inside. They didn't do that, and so that was for me one of the best actually outcomes that the US did not show up. And that again meant that the COP was in a certain way, you could see that the different countries, blocs, and interests who were kind of trying to shuffle their way around in this new surrounding. Also very interesting geopolitically. And I think what you see and what you've seen here, I think also very clearly is that the emergence of a forum where you see two big blocks basically for the future standing against each other. One is the fossil block, and the other one is the renewable countries block. So you have the U.S., Russia, and some of the oil petrostates, although they are sitting on a fence somewhere on the one side, and then you have countries like the EU, China, and then on the other side, and then others trying to see how they kind of develop in this or how they behave in this new geopolitical order. And that is something I think you could see pretty well. You could see that the basic countries were some of them were much more vocal than they had before. The EU was testing their new role, so you'd see a lot of uncertainty in how do we play this game in the COP, this geopolitical game. And one thing I found, and this is what Avantika said also, to me, what was really surprising were some parts or some results, or rather not results, that the Brazilian presidency brought about. I think everybody was positively surprised about the first week. Everything was handled very smoothly, very professionally. The logistics were much better than we all had thought. And also the logistics of the conference were handled rather smoothly. I found it a very clever move to take the 4 issues that had been able to blow up the whole thing at the beginning with an agenda fight, and to say we take them and then at the end we'll forge them into some kind of declaration. I found that a very clever move. But then at the end of it, and in the second week, I thought myself, what happened to this presidency? What it kind of fell. It fell out. It fell, and my explanation was that I think the Brazilians had prepared everything pretty well, but they did not overcome these things. I think also the contradiction in their own government. So I think it is only partly right to say that the tough thing, the fossil fuel thing, came in the second week, and it came from the industrialized countries. My impression was something different. My impression was that President Lula put it. Nobody knew anything about this, and he put it on the stage right at the beginning. And my impression was that everyone was surprised. Most of all the Brazilians, most of all the COP presidency, suddenly they had something on the table they had not been thinking about, but their own president had said, well, this is something that we need and we want. And I think this, to me, explains this kind of in a way, this kind of unprofessionalism at the end, that they did not know how to handle this, because they were not surprised, they were not supposed, or they were not really prepared for this. And the second thing that really surprised me was that there was so little done in terms of forests. I had thought, being in the Amazon, being in Brazil, having a Brazilian presidency, we'll get a really strong outcome for forests. And we have the TFFF. Nobody knows if that's going to fly at all, if there will be enough money in the foretime, and if the whole scheme works. And then we have this rather weak roadmap for forests that nobody really knows what's happening. So that actually surprised me at the end. But it also turned out that the whole issue on transitioning away, the tough question is really a tough question, because you see everything coming together in that. You see the drive that this is an issue, the elephant in the room that hasn't been talked for the first 20 years in the COPs, hasn't been talked about. You see a lot of countries having a real stake in this. And you see if we talk about, and then this is my last point, if we talk implementation, you see what's happening, or rather what is not happening in the real world in this. Because what I think globally what we see is a situation that what's working is the buildup of renewable energy, right? Globally. And this is something that everybody, if you talk about the success story, or if you talk about what's working in the whole process, everybody will come and say, we'll have this huge buildup of renewable energy, mostly China, but also a lot of other countries. What does not work is the other part of it, meaning the phase down, the build down, the taking, the shrinking of the fossil industry. So you see both at the same time. You see the buildup of the renewables, but you don't see the vanishing, the absolutely necessary vanishing of the emissions and of the fossil industry. And so this whole tough question goes directly into that. Into that, that's a pain point, so to say, and that's why I think this is one of the big contradictions. The COPs, but the whole global energy system is having right now, and that's because I think that's why we're going to see this over the next years, moving to the forefront with all the other questions, with our finance, and it's all right. Trade is coming in, very good, very interesting question, very important. But this thing of is it enough to build up renewables? No, it's not. And if you look at the emission curve, you'll see that. And if there's no answer to that, the whole thing will blow up, I think. So much for me.
Thank you very much, Bernhard. Yes, I mean, if you look back also over the last couple of years, phasing in is obviously much easier than phasing out. So as I remember, the GST targets to triple renewables and double energy efficiency improvements by 2030 were actually agreed essentially already way ahead, way before the Dubai conference at the G20 meeting, for example, whereas transition away from fossil fuels was then the big fight at the Dubai conference. Right, and another observation. So, transitioning from fossil fuels wasn't in the formal diplomatic process, but I think one reason for that was because it hadn't been possible to put it already in there at COP29 in Baku. So there had been proposals to, for example, use the mitigation work program to take forward the global stocktake outcomes on mitigation, or the dialogues on following up on the GST. But there as well, it hadn't been possible to specifically pick up points of the global stocktake. And so, yeah, it wasn't possible to use the formal diplomatic process to discuss fossil fuels in Belém, because it already hadn't been possible to pick that up at the previous COP in Baku. And so, yeah, I mean, and as long as countries have to decide by consensus, so if some countries simply don't want to have the specific issues on the agenda, they can block them, and then what to do if other countries think that they absolutely have to be on the agenda. Bernhard, a quick follow-up observation, and then I want to come to the next part.
Really just quickly, because I just forgot that, because you just said that again was something I found very interesting, that the presidency, obviously, as it turns out later now, kind of misrepresented the feeling in the room concerning the phase out. It's what Avantika said. There was this research from Carbon Brief, who said that the presidency said there's like 80 countries in favor of tough and 80 countries hardly against it. When you look at the countries, when they asked the country, it turned out there were much less countries saying we are against it. There were a lot more countries that said we don't stand in the way of any kind of dialogue in terms of phasing out, because we have our own national circumstances, and of course India has a different view on that than France, for example. But it seems that the ability or the willingness to talk about something like a tough, in whichever form, was much bigger than the Brazilian presidency actually represented it. So what you say is right. It was not able to do this in Baku, but then the Baku presidency was very special on this. And this again is for me one of the big riddles in this presidency. Why, with all the professionalism, the Brazilians were not able to say, well, it's not 80-80, it's something like 120-30, which makes a totally different point. So let's see if we can find some common ground here in any way. That's again, I don't know an answer to that.
Okay, thank you. So we have a very lively discussion in the chat, or quite a number of questions being raised. One is that there's a very intensive discussion on the legal standing of the advisory opinions of the ICJ and the other international courts. I myself am not a lawyer, but if anybody else on the panel feels capable of and wants to weigh in on this question, to what extent the COP should have referred to these legal opinions and what difference they could make. Yeah, raise your hand, feel free to do so. Then we also have a question, yeah, what people feel about that trade became a topic at the COP. So Avantika, and I think also Anas already said they felt it was a good thing. Connecting the COP to the real economy, but yeah, but there's a question on, is it really a good thing, or may it rather create complications with the WTO and so on? So that's another question from the chat, which somebody on the panel may want to respond to. Right. Avantika already said she's happy to address that question. Yeah, emergence of a fossil alliance. Bernhard already picked up on that point, but maybe somebody, maybe Bernhard or somebody else wants to go further on this. Right, and then there's a question about carbon crediting. Not sure if we have any carbon crediting experts here. But yeah, if people feel comfortable talking about this. Oh yeah, Max, of course, sorry. Max is actually working on Article 6 issues. Right. So Avantika already put herself forward for speaking to trade, and also feel free to speak to any other issues raised in the chat. And then, yeah, Max, maybe on Article 6, and Anna, Bernhard, if you also want to come in on some of the questions. But we'll go with Avantika first. Go ahead, please.
Great. No, thanks for the great questions to everybody attending. So I think before I get to the trade point, since Bernhard was already talking about the TAF, I wanted to just come in very briefly on that as well, because there are some questions I can see on the fossil fuel phase out question as well. If that's okay with you, Wolfgang? Okay. So I think the thing about the TAF is that there has been this whole discourse about how the Baku COP did not spotlight fossil fuels. But each of these conferences have a, a fairly predetermined agenda that countries work towards for many, many months, not just at the COP, but in the intersessional period at Bonn, at in their negotiating groups. Baku was very clearly, it was written into the Paris Agreement that we're going to have a revised finance goal in 2024. So everybody knew that it was the time to discuss finance. So I think that's where we had a big disconnect with this sort of issue being raised about why fossil fuels and mitigation is not a big priority, but it was supposed to be a finance COP. It's where finance was supposed to be discussed. Similarly, here, we didn't see any clear agenda being put forth on a roadmap in the months leading up to COP, giving countries the time to reflect, make submissions, have a discussion. If you saw a process like the Baku to Belém roadmap, which the Brazilian presidency was convening, there was submission after submission. There were multiple rounds of submissions sought, views were sought to produce this final report that captured views from finance ministers, from parties, from governments, from civil society. But we don't hear anything about something like this. And then when you have formal agenda items that are coming very often from developing countries, often what happens in the sort of political chess game is as soon as demands are put on the table for finance or let's say now unilateral trade measures or a just transition mechanism, the finance demand in this case for COP30 was tripling of adaptation finance. Somehow it's always mitigation that is brought in as this sort of bargaining chip, and that just plays out in a very unhealthy, unconstructive way, and it puts countries on the defensive. So we had conversations as civil society with multiple ministers, with negotiators of developed countries as well as developing countries. And what we were hearing throughout the conference is that we won't put, from developed countries, we won't put adaptation finance on the table unless we get a strong outcome on mitigation. And that's a very kind of a bad faith approach when adaptation finance is being demanded by some of the most vulnerable countries of the world. But because we heard arguments like Saudi has not put up a new NDC, India is yet to put up an NDC, though India announced at the conference that the NDC is imminent. But that kind of bargaining and sort of horse trading of agenda items just creates a very sort of bad faith process. And I think that is what really puts countries on the defensive. Whereas something like a roadmap is absolutely critical, I think. In terms of all of the elements that have to go onto it, I think no country is going to disagree that you need to discuss, economic diversification pathways, finance and trade barriers, opportunities to scale up renewable energy. There's a lot of things that can go into it. So I think this sort of the tension and acrimony that comes is because of the way the political chess play actually happens. So I think I just wanted to speak very briefly to that. On the trade issue, I think it's very interesting. So last year, CSC published a report as a Global South response to the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which has been floated first by the European Union, but also now by the United Kingdom and other countries are considering it. So at this point, we are at a place where the climate and trade agendas are converging very clearly. Because something like a carbon border adjustment tax, it's not simply a climate measure. It kind of directly affects, implicates exports and export competitiveness of countries, and particularly developing countries who do have carbon intensive manufacturing processes. And we've also seen a trend over the past few decades of offshoring of heavy manufacturing from developed to developing countries, from OECD to non-OECD countries. So we're at a point now where we have to have these conversations in tandem. Now, there has been a bit of a ping pong between like, should this be said at the WTO? Should this be done at the UNFCCC? The WTO has been discussing environment related issues for a few decades, or since its short existence. But the WTO as a space right now is quite paralyzed. One of the reasons being the appellate body is not being allowed to move forward. It's kind of seen as a space that is hamstrung at the moment. The UNFCCC, on the other hand, Article 3.5 of the UN Convention written in 1992, talks about trade measures not implicating the trade of different countries. So I think the UNFCCC has been very well positioned to start this conversation. What developing countries really wanted was a formal agenda item with a negotiating mandate. What we have right now is 3 years of dialogues. I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. I think it's a good compromise. Um, at the very least, what it will do is it will allow countries, it will provide a space for countries under the protection of the UNFCCC. The UNFCCC has very strong principles on equity, common but differentiated responsibility. It will provide a space for countries to come and talk about their experiences, their grievances, their impacts from these certain measures, and perhaps raise some constructive way forward. So I do think this is one positive outcome of the COP process, and we really hope that countries come and actually discuss in good faith in these spaces. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. If you want to follow up on this, there's a follow-up comment has been raised on whether whether these trade disputes shouldn't rather be brought before the WTO dispute settlement mechanism rather than being brought to the UNFCCC. Do you have an opinion on that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think I addressed it in my comments to say that the WTO is completely paralyzed at the moment. And if there is momentum at the UNFCCC, particularly given that many trade measures like a CBAM do have a very strong element of carbon pricing, of decarbonization pathways in that discussion. So I think the UNFCCC is very well equipped. But I will check if maybe Anna has some further thoughts on that.
Right. Yeah. I think one point here is, as you said, Avantika, that the UNFCCC has been able to agree on a constructive process, which will involve the WTO, as if I read correctly. Whereas if it was brought before the WTO, it would be a dispute. Maybe not so much a constructive conversation. Yeah, but others on the panel, Bernhard, do you go ahead to trade or any of the other issues?
Anna, you want to go first on this? I don't want to.
I was going to change topics. So if you want to build on trade, please go ahead.
Yeah, then just shortly from me, I think that the most important thing is that trade is moving into the center of this debate. Because for the last years, it's been two different strands of trade and of discussion, right? There's the climate or the UNFCCC discussion, and there's a trade discussion. And now these two merging, coming together, I think is really important for many reasons. One is the whole CBAM dispute, as Avantika says rightly. But I think at least you have to recognize that the EU CBAM is now kicking off this discussion in a real urgent way, which I think is a good and very necessary step. And then I think with the whole global discussion around trade coming from the US administration using trade as a weapon, again, this is a burning issue that and knowing how the international division of labor is working in terms of just reminding us that mostly all of the, or basically all of the renewable techniques these days come from China. So there is a huge discussion, or there's a huge urge to resolve this problem or this issue, trade and doing something on climate change. And I totally, I think that's one of the best outcomes, that this has become clear, that there has to be an informed discussion. Where it's going to take place, I'm not so sure. I agree on the problems that the WTO has on that, just being an organization that isn't really working these days. But the realization, and I think the Brazilians also have pushed this forward, they even came up with their own not so well received idea of linking the emission trading systems, or also the systems of the EU, China, and Brazil together. with some kind of some idea of a CO2 price and these things. And then interestingly enough, they also came up with the CBAM in this. They said, so the Brazilian point was, as long as we're outside of the CBAM, it's a bad thing. But as soon as we have a system like that, we need a CBAM once we're in there, which is kind of interesting. So I don't see a really resolve in this, but the first step is that there's a realization that that we need to talk about this urgently, and I see that, and that's and now one of the big issues is what's the forum to talk about this, and who's on the table, especially if you have a country, the biggest economy in the world, who's playing tariffs and trade as a means of political bargaining, right? So we're going to see a lot of movement in that, I think, in the next month and years to come.
Thank you. Anna, you wanted to come in on another topic? Go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Wolfgang. And maybe only on trade, but just one sentence saying what, and not understanding fully what's happening with the World Trade Organization and so on. But what we have heard from especially small developing countries is also that, of course, they have a better voice and representation in the UNFCCC than in the WTO. So that's a great argument to have a stronger voice, which is something that Bernard, you were also pointing at. So yeah, I think that's part of the strategy as well. But I wanted to speak about coalitions that we saw at COP, right? Like we had a question on like, is there a fossil fuel like coalition emerging with like Trump, but the US not being there, but also the oil economies pushing. And I wanted to like, we mentioned some, but to do like a run out of what we have seen. Starting with what, Avantika, you have said, and I think it's very important, the High Ambition Coalition is slowly dying, at least for what we have seen, for exactly the reasons that you were pointing at. This trade-off between mitigation and adaptation finance that we saw really breaks the trust of the EU and the smaller countries that developing countries that were asking for this. So either they rebuild this trust, or the coalition that really brought up the Paris Agreement and that then has been trying to push for ambition was really weakened at this COP. So yeah, here we see, especially on finance, the classical story that we see on like the North-South divide, let's say. But of course, COP was way beyond this of like understatement. I would say also we saw how, let's say, industrialized and also large emerging economies united to support the COP outcome. So when the second week, when everything were a bit dark and you didn't know what was going on, the presidency was having consultations for sure, and I'm sure they talked to the big ones, let's say. And at some point, who was complaining in the corridors, but also at the very end of the plenary, were the smaller countries that were less consulted. So I'm talking here about ILAC and Colombia raising this at the very end, you know, like the fossil fuel thing. So I think to me, there's also a dynamic of who was most included, but also who was already fine with the outcome that we had, the Mutirão package that was proposed by the presidency. And here we saw leadership by some of the, for example, BRICS and so on. But in the end, I think everyone agreed with the outcome, including the European Union and so on, all the large and emerging economies. And that's versus the small ones, which is the worrying thing of the second week that we were discussing. Everyone felt really sidelined compared to the first week when everything was more inclusive and the countries were very happy and so on. So all these dynamics played, and also what was said in the chat that then we can comment as well, but this coalition of like the more, or that's the typical story we see also in media, like, oh, the oil states or like fossil fuel states, how they tried to block for this roadmap and so on. I think that's one part of it that also exists. And there's for sure also fossil fuel lobbyists at COP, but that's only part of what was playing out in this very complicated dynamic of global geopolitics at COP. So here, just like some ideas that I'm sure are missing some other analysis as well. Feel free to complement.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, and I think some of the questions that were raised in the chat can actually be read up on in the table briefings on the COP and in our Wuppertal report. For example, the question why the EU didn't hold out longer on fossil fuels, or why exactly the ICJ and other advisory opinions were not picked up in COP decisions. We and table briefings actually covered these elements in our report and reporting. Right, then, yeah, I would like to finish looking back. Oh, sorry, there was the crediting question still. Sorry, Max, go ahead.
Yeah, no worries. I think my answer here it's quite quick because whenever it comes to crediting, it's a lot of speculation also involved. So looking in how far the way the European Union will use international credits is still under negotiation, right? But they're sure, like it's in the European trilogue, but sure, I think it will give impulses into the dynamics and how far the PACAM will influence the NDCs and back and forth. But when I understand the question correctly, then it's about the pre-2036 period, so before compliance. And as also said in the chat correctly, before compliance, there is the idea to make a pilot phase for 5 years, which brings us to 2031. And then I'm not the German government, of course, so that's only speculation. What I assume is, and that the EU wants, if they decide to participate on the market, they want to shape the structures of the market. So I expect them to further engage in capacity building. I mean, especially Germany is was quite supportive in capacity building in the global south countries in the last years with many programs. So I think they will be continued. And there is a ICI call, an ICI project for financing removals with private capital. So I mean, there you see kind of in how like that they already in pre-compliance phase, they try to push structures within the market, which they then later eventually use. So that a quick kind of quick thoughts just on that.
Okay, thank you. Bernhard, one last comment on this round.
No, I would rather come in with on the Court of Justice and on one of the questions that was just in the chat on the fossil fuel treaty. But if we want to do it in the next round, no problem.
Yeah, I was actually going to open the next round now.
Okay.
And I was going to ask you to go first because you were last in the first round. Yeah, so the second round is going to be about, as was actually now also just raised in the chat, how do we go forward? So given that once again, the results of the COP are rather lackluster, so what can be done to get a better outcome at COP31? And among other things, what do you on the panel expect from the just transition mechanism? The processes now led by Brazil for fossil fuel and deforestation roadmaps, and the fossil transition conference in Colombia, which was also just raised in the chat. Yeah, but feel free to also pick up on any other points in this overarching questions. What do we do? What can parties do to get a better outcome at the next conference? And Bernhard, go ahead first, please. Apparently the connection dropped. Okay, let's maybe wait for a second. Okay, then we can only hope that Bernhard will manage to reconnect, and Avantika, I'll hand it over to you. What are your thoughts on how to go forward after this COP?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's a tough job because we are also kind of just processing after this COP, what are the kind of useful next steps that should really come about. I think definitely all of the conversations around just transition, the fossil fuel roadmap, the new trade dialogues are pointing to the need to have a very kind of real world mature conversation about what the energy transition really looks like for different countries. We need to discuss what the differentiated trajectories of different countries will look like. No two countries will do the transition in the same way. It will be obviously according to national capacities, but also in accordance with development aspirations, industrial aspirations. I think green industrialization is going to be a huge priority for many developing countries, and we need to link all of those conversations to the next steps on any plan to transition away from fossil fuels, decarbonize. So we need to have much more real world rooted conversations. Some of the good momentum, none of these conversations can be had without discussions on the enablers or the barriers, which largely amount to the global financial system, the global trade regime, and things like that. On that front, there have been very constructive conversations over the past few years. I would say over the past 2-3 years, all the discussions on global financial system reform, the spotlighting of the global sovereign debt crisis, the issue of high cost of capital, these have become very prominent. Now would be the time to really tie them into future conversations on envisioning how they are hindering the ability of many countries to phase out fossil fuels. So I think that is my very broad, non-specific response to what is needed right now, but very real-world rooted, mature conversations about how the transition looks like for different countries and how we can really remove the barriers that is preventing them right now. Did I miss anything else? No, I think I'll stop here now.
Right, and quick follow-up question. Do you think the new just transition mechanism could be a space to have these real-world discussions, or where else under the UNFCCC would you see them?
Certainly, the just transition mechanism has a lot of potential. I think one of the maybe it was a planned flaw, or maybe it was just something that it was the only way to kind of pass it through politically. But a lot of specifics were not really laid out about the mechanism ahead of time. Yes, many civil society groups did have proposals in place for what the mechanism can and should do, and many possible functions, but in the final decision, it's kept quite vague. So perhaps that was intentional or by design. So there is potential to kind of really use that as a space to have some of these conversations. There is a big conversation to be had around the social justice, labor, welfare aspects of the transition. And I expect the just transition mechanism to really drive on that front. But the sort of interconnection of the transition with even questions of green industrialization, trade barriers, and things like that, without which the transition cannot be just, I think they would be appropriate under this mechanism. I think it's really up to governments and civil society to start figuring out how this mechanism can start to take shape and become a place for some concrete action and not just, another kind of talk shop.
Thank you. Bernhard, you're back. Great. Then you're up next. Your thoughts, please,
I'm
on
back.
how
Sorry,
to
this is what happens once you want to start talking. Somebody turns off your mic. It sounds like the last hours of COP, the plenary. No, sorry. Yeah, I mean, looking ahead, I'm afraid. I was just thinking about it. I'm afraid I have pretty bad news, I think, because what I see is, as I said before, the COPs are diminishing in importance and value. And I think also with the geopolitical setting and the economic setting that we have all around the world. So I think we see, on the one hand, we see a buildup of more pressing or of more factors that keep pressing for more climate action, right? We've talked about the court, the International Court of Justice, and we see lots of these action in courts happening. We see, of course, everything that's happening outside in the real world in terms of damages and in terms of how these things are happening. But I think if you look at this COP and if you look at the geopolitical setting, you must say that the only real reason to move ahead are coalition of the willing. Are countries or actors from the action agenda, that not countries, subnational level that get together and say we are going to do something no matter what's happening in the real world. And I think this is good news actually on the one hand, but it's also bad news because it means we are losing this kind of UN approach, leave no one behind, and everybody is signed on to this. And I'm afraid that what we are going to see right now is a concentration of everything that is doable and profitable in an economic sense. That means we'll see a lot of the deployment of renewables everywhere. But what we will also see, I think, is a diminishing factor or a diminishing focus on, I put it bluntly, helping others, right? Finance, adaptation finance, any kind of adaptation things. You see with the crumbling of the UN system and of the consensus, you see, I think you will see a lot less money and effort going into helping others who are the victims of this, the most vulnerable. This is a shame, and this is a huge scandal, and is also in the long run and the medium run also economically terrible. But I think this is what we will have to face in the next decade, I think, or maybe years, at least as long as we have a US administration as we have it now. And so I think we'll see this splitting up into, we're going to do a lot in the realm of what's economically feasible and economically doable. We're going to see some of it in what coalition of the willing, with rests of we are also indebted and or we are also forced, and we also want to help the most vulnerable and the poor people. But you'll see a lot less focus on real effective structural assistance to countries and populations that really need it. And so that is a pretty bleak outlook. I'm sorry, but this is what I have seen for the last years actually. And looking forward, I'm not so optimistic that in the next COPs we'll all come together and decide that there's a new will of togetherness in this. I might be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. And there is some extent to the opposite. So with the ICJ decision, for example, there's talk that the General Assembly in the UN will actually come and have a vote on this. So the General Assembly is going to vote on what does this mean, but then the real important actors, if you look at the G20, for example, I don't see much willingness of the important actors, not even the EU. If you look at the state of the EU inside in terms of climate policy, to really go forward and do at least a part of what is needed. So I think we're going to see this fragmentation of climate policy, and I think we have to get to terms with a lot less focus on how to buffer these things for the most vulnerable.
Thank you, Bernhard. Then Anna, go ahead. What do you think could be done to get to better results next year? inside and beyond the COP.
Thanks, Wolfgang. And I agree with what has been said, and I'll try to build on it. But I think it's both. We are seeing more fragmentation and these relations being more transactional, and then also this need to bring the real issues inside COP and link better climate and development. And on this part, I had some interesting conversations during the COP, and what I saw from developed countries is that they're still thinking that they are going to COP only to negotiate, let's say, greenhouse gas emission reductions. They are not seeing the development. I mean, maybe some are, of course, but this was not as strong as my discourse as what we have been discussing here. And I think that also poses the challenge for the Just Transition Work Program, definitely, for what it could do. Well, not the work program anymore, the Just Transition mechanism now. So yeah, here are some thoughts on what can this do going forward, but noting these challenges. So what we have seen so far in the Just Transition Work Program, now establishing a mechanism, is that there's a big divide on what is understood by a just transition. If you ask the EU, also the other developed countries that were in the room, they always talk about jobs, they talk about including society in decisions, these type of things, very national, versus what you have as the demands of, like, I would say, the entire developing world, with the G77 saying this is also about access to opportunities. This is also about international cooperation, because the transition in your country will also affect others. Of course, this is also a way to put like CBDR and other things in here, and that's why the EU and others are pushing back. But resolving this, it's key, I mean, not only for the mechanism to function, but also for including better like development policies in the climate space, which is definitely needed because of everything we have been discussing, because the interest in trade, industrial policy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think if this divide is not solved, and that's very difficult, and that's work for the coming presidencies, for civil society, and so on. I mean, we will have a work for a mechanism, we will have functions, and we will see where the discussions go. But there will always be this like very different understanding and this divide, and it will not lead to, I don't know, everything that could be done on like equity and fairness that is needed in the transition. And what I want to add with the just transition mechanism is that to us, its real importance, it's that it's the only place that can send this type of signals on fairness and equity. To say these principles are really embedded in the Paris Agreement and in the UFCCC, but there's very few ways to operationalize them, and that could be one of them. That could be the way to actually say, what does fairness and equity mean going forward in the transition? And the UFCCC is the only one that can do that and send it to the rest of the world. So if now there's, I don't know, a coalition of business wanting to implement a transition and fund renewable energy, things like this, there's no way that no one is telling them there should be some principles of inclusion, of equity and fairness in it. Is the UFCCC, like, it's the forum that can send this signal to the outside world, and this work program and the mechanism is the one that can do it. So this is very important for the transition going forward, and I think it's key for many developing countries, but I see there are still lots of frictions on how we actually achieve this. So this is key to me on the next steps going forward and what can countries do, but I also see many challenges, especially with the context we are in.
Thank you. Then my final questions. Yeah, so from my perspective, actually, the fact that the UNFCCC is now discussing these real world issues is actually progress, because during its first 30 years, essentially up till Glasgow, it was always only about emission targets in an abstract way. Defining adequate emission targets, defining adequate burden sharing somehow. But it was never possible to talk about how can we actually achieve those emission targets. And now, in my perspective, at least the COP is discussing the right kind of questions, even if it has so far not been able to answer them, but it is now discussing the right kind of questions. Yeah, my final question to you is, well, if the COP continues having problems with finding the right answers, do you see any other international venues that could move this forward? So in the chat, the Columbia conference was raised. Is that something? I've seen academic work on suggesting to focus on investment treaties and international tax agreements in order to raise the necessary finance and achieve a number of other important effects. Do you think there are other international venues that could be used to move this forward if the COP continues to be so slow and time continues running out? Anyone who wants to go first?
I mean, I can start if you want,
Go
but
ahead.
I'll repeat also what Bernard was saying, right? Like we are seeing how this is more complicated, how we live in a more transactional world. So the type of cooperation that we will see going forward is more, as he was putting it, like to help on economics or like to have a win-win situation related to like investment in renewable energy and things like this, but less for assistance. But that to me calls for the need for any type of cooperation. So now we are speaking of the multilateral system, but we need the plurilateral, the multilateral, the bilateral, and not to imagine that one can be worse than the other. Of course, here there's the question of where's equity in that, and that's something we want to work on next year. Like, how do you actually, because UNFCCC is, I mean, equal for everyone in the sense of like having a voice and being represented and so on. And if we start with coalitions and so on, that's something that other speakers have also pointed that it leaves less space for this type of approach. So as I was saying, many different types of cooperation. I think we can see how to advance with any of those. And to me, we can do it in sectoral systems or value chains. And we have examples of like how the steel conversation is progressing specifically on that value chain and things like this. And there will be specific cooperation initiatives. There will be maybe existing fora that will want to take this, but that's very, very specific to each of these sectors. And the other thing that we really need is a reform of the international financial system. And that is happening somewhere else. This is a conversation that is ongoing that I'm not sure when or if we will get it, but that is something outside the UNFCCC that would help unlock many of the discussions that we're having on climate. But I think in general, it's something that's worth exploring and a conversation that was also had after Copenhagen, right? Like everyone was very sad and down after the Copenhagen COP. And there was this discussion of like, should we abandon COPs and now go to other spaces? To me, it's worth revisiting what was the thought back then, what can we do now, what are the mechanisms that we use, but of course, without abandoning the UNFCCC, which is the place where everyone has a voice. So yeah, I think Avantika, you may want to react.
Avantika, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll come in very briefly. Yeah, no disagreement with anything that Anna said, but just also sharing my own reflection that I don't think the cops are going anywhere. And this is not a response to Anna because she did not say that, but anybody else who is sort of raising a doom and gloom sort of view. I think the multilateral process is very important, and we remain committed to kind of ensuring that we should remain committed to ensuring that it remains a big presence. And I think most countries don't have an incentive, except for the US that likes to keep exiting and then re-entering. I think most countries don't have an incentive to kind of exit this space because, you know, countries, I believe, do also have a genuine interest in sort of advancing their own decarbonization pathways, being a part of the climate conversation. I mean, it may not seem like it because it's a tough conversation. There's a lot of different competing national interests, but I think the space remains extremely important. But that said, at the same time, if other spaces are proliferating, advancing different types of agenda, I think that's a very good thing. And I think maybe that's an example of just coalitions of the willing in action and in implementation. So if you are having certain conversations like the G20 was always built for economic governance, but if you are seeing certain conversations advancing there on crucial issues that intersect with climate, such as conversations on debt, conversations on cost of capital, it's a very promising thing, and I think it's something that should continue. And all other kind of plurilateral, bilateral, smaller space conversations will take forward coalitions of the willing for different sectors, etc., like Anna mentioned. I think the Colombia conference, just my last point, and since that was brought up a few times, I think it's a very, very bold political signal that has been made by Colombia. And I think it's a very bold sort of expression that they made in the final closing plenary on mitigation being inadequately addressed at this COP. I will say that there is a certain precarity associated with Colombia's position. They do have elections coming up. They are taking on this mantle, kind of as a country, you know, charging forward on a very bold proposal. So they need the right kind of support on this, and I really hope that enough countries join them in sort of taking forward their bold proposal and don't kind of leave them as like an island in the storm. And if this conversation at the conference that they are hosting adequately considers all of the different national contexts, barriers, and sort of advances conversations within the bounds of equity, CBDR, etc., the way UNFCCC is designed to do, I think it can be very promising. So I think all power to them, and I really do hope they get a lot of support in advancing this agenda because it is very tough to do in the current global environment.
Thank you. Over to you, Bernhard.
Yeah, just briefly, I mean, if you think about where could this conversation happen, I think there are theoretical and there are practical issues or fora. A theoretical forum, of course, would be the G20. We all know 80% of the emissions, 80% of the solution would be there. So if they got their act together and talked and acted on that, I think we would see unprecedented action, but I'm not really seeing that. Then I think the next forum where this could happen is, of course, what you said, WTO and the whole trade thing. I don't see so far. I don't see really a forum where that is all brought together and focused. But if anybody finds that, or if that develops, that might be very interesting. I think also the BRICS countries could be actually a good point. We saw them coming together in force in at least partly in Berlin on this. I'm not so sure if they really got if they are really acting on that, if the contradictions within themselves aren't too big anyway. But that, if we talk about theoretical, that would be a huge a great place to talk about this. And of course, bilateral initiatives, right? So if you see EU, China moving maybe on this, or EU, India, these things. But if you talk about practical issues or fora, I think, again, coalition of the willing, you'll see them jump up everywhere, I think, on certain things. I think what Avantika said is very important, that in debt and trade issues, or mostly in these, that climate is being not the center but a part of the discussion and not going away, but just being an integral part of the whole debate, which is a good thing. I think what we haven't talked about also in theoretical terms is the UN and the UN reform. The UN is under a huge pressure. UN is looking for a new general secretary, but also the whole system. And we're not only talking about UNFCCC, but also, I mean, this is one of the big things that was missing in Belém, any kind of debate on the UNFCCC reform, which is urgently needed as well as the whole UN reform. So let's see where this is going. I think what we should not forget is what the Brazil opened up with the action agenda, any kind of subnational actors. I think we'll see a lot of development there. This will not be organized in a way as we are used to on a national level and big global things, but I think there's a lot of action, and there might be even much more action in terms of cities, regions, philanthropies, you name it, universities, research. And I think lastly, two things. First of all, one shouldn't rule out the idea of any surprise movement. So there might be behind the horizon things that we don't see yet. Let's remember, nobody saw in 2019, 2020 the movement of the young people, Greta Thunberg and whoever. Nobody saw that coming, and it made a huge impact, at least in some countries. So we don't know what's happening with that or in any kind of unforeseen development. And second, or a second thing I would say, all this is not worth anything if not in the real economy there's not anything like a phase out, turn down development away from the the fossil fuel industry that is going in the exactly wrong direction right now. If you see everything, the opening up of new fossil in oil, but mostly in gas. We just had this report of almost 280 projects in new LNG terminals all over the world. So the real economy, in at least in large parts of the world, is not going into a decarbonization, but in a recarbonization issue or a direction. And if that is not being stopped, then everything else we're talking about here is basically nonsense, or is basically will not make a huge difference. So I think that is something we have to keep in mind, that if we're talking about where will the next COP be and what will the next COP talk about, as long as this development is not being halted and then reversed, all this is going to lead nowhere in the sense of more climate action, but rather less, actually.
Thank you. Then I thank all of you for this very profound discussion, which some participants also commented in the chat, and I fully agree with that. I myself learned a lot about what were the negotiation dynamics and different understandings at the COP. Yeah, and I think we had a very good discussion on what can be learned and how may we go forward. So thank you very much to all of you for being here, also to the participants for spending time with us. And I'll guess we'll meet again in the not too distant future.
Thanks so much.
Thanks to all of you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Very interesting.
Thank you. Bye-bye.